Hello. You find yourself at a railway switching station. A train is barreling down the tracks. There's a switch in front of you where you can divert the train to go from one track to the other. On the first track stands 5 people, all innocent workers. They come to work today, expecting to go home this evening. On the other track stands another worker, also came to work today, expecting to go home this evening. You're at the control. You have to decide which way this train goes. Will you let it hit the 5, or will you divert it to hit the 1? Think about this as we go through this video, and think about how you would react in this situation. I'm Dr. Zachariah Renfro, and in this video we're going to talk about utilitarianism, and we're going to talk about the book, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. Starting off with our trolley problem, the situation I described at the beginning. Surveys among many people find that the majority of Americans believe that if put in this situation, they would divert the train, choosing to hit one person rather than hitting 5. However, a recent episode of Vsauce's Minefield put this assumption to the test. 8 participants were placed in a simulated railway control station, and a train was sent barreling down towards groups of people. Of the 8 participants, only 2 made the choice to divert the train to save the lives of 5 people. One individual began crying and decided to divert the train, and the other immediately diverted the train. What the study found was that in situations of pressure, moral decision-making tends to go out the window, and individuals tend to assume that it's someone else's responsibility. They tend to freeze up in situations of danger, relying on technology or other people to protect the lives of others. This is a startling revelation because it shows that many people, when faced with moral dilemmas, lack the moral courage to perform an action which could save lives, which leads us into our discussion today on utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the philosophy that the morally correct action is the action which provides the most good or utility for the greatest number of people. The immoral action is the action which causes the most harm to the greatest number of people. Utilitarianism was founded by John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham back in the late 1700s and early 1800s, and they were what you might call a classical utilitarian. They created this theory in response to the theories of Kant, which was built on deontology, which is a strict rules-based theory built on the idea that every person has certain obligations and duties which they must fulfill, and that the ultimate determinant of the morality of an action was the intentions that a person brought into the action. So within utilitarianism, intentions don't really matter. How you intend for things to go isn't the ultimate determiner of morality. It is the outcomes, either the foreseeable outcome or the actual outcome. Utility is calculated with a hedonic or felicific calculus. Bentham came up with this, and there are 7 factors with which you can determine the overall utility or morality of an action. The intensity of the happiness brought about. The duration, how long does it last? For example, it is better to get an intense pleasure that lasts a long time than an intense pleasure that lasts a short time. Certainty, how likely is it that this will occur? If you eat a sandwich, it is very certain that you'll no longer feel hunger pains and that you will feel full. How soon? Is this pleasure going to be in the next day, in the next hour, in the next year? Will it repeat? Will this pleasure repeat over time? Will it be followed by pain? So with the sandwich example, if you know it's a poison sandwich and you eat it, then it will be followed with pain, so you might not want to eat it. And how many people will be affected? Is it just yourself that's affected? Or in the case of our train, will it be 5 people, 10 people, 1 person, right? So these are the questions these are the calculations that utilitarianism seeks to have people make when they're making decisions. So when it comes to pleasures, there are two opposing views. Bentham argues that all pleasures are the same. So for example, you will get the same amount of pleasure from reading Hamlet as you would from drinking a beer. John Stuart Mill argues that there are higher and lower pleasures. For example, reading Hamlet might be, kind of grueling on the face of it, but by the time you come to the end of Hamlet, you'll have gained greater mental pleasure. John Stuart Mill stated that it would be better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. And when it comes to things which lead to happiness or lead to pleasure, lead to utility, there are some things that are useful as tools, and then there are some things that are useful in and of themselves. So happiness, pleasure, those have utility in and of themselves, whereas something such as money only has utility in that it allows you to pursue other pleasures. There are several types of utilitarians. Act utilitarians, they believe that for every action, you have to go through this calculus and determine the morality of it. Then there's rule utilitarians. They use a little bit of foresight and a little bit of analysis, and they determine, okay, if in 99 cases out of 10, stealing something leads to greater unhappiness than happiness, then we should create a rule that says no stealing. In this way, rule utilitarians get to have their cake and eat it too. They can come up with ideas and theories that justify things such as natural rights, while also claiming that the morally correct answer is the one that leads to the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. And then finally, we have actual consequence versus foreseeable consequence utilitarians. How this breaks down can be a little tricky. Imagine that you're in a rowboat going across a lake and you come upon someone drowning. Being the good utilitarian you are, you go through the hedonic calculus and you determine it would bring greater pleasure to the greatest number of people for you to pull this person out of the water and save them. So you save them, you put the person in your boat, and then when you row them back to shore, they immediately get out of your boat and take out a gun and begin shooting people. An actual consequence utilitarian would say that you acted immorally because the end result of you saving this person was that they got out of the water to begin killing people. However, a foreseeable consequence utilitarian would say that you, as a reasonable person, had no way of knowing that this person was going to go out and commit mass murder after you saved their life. So that's how the difference is delineated. An additional problem that comes up between actual versus foreseeable consequence utilitarians is the issue of where does your moral responsibility end? In the case of saving the drowning person, does your moral responsibility end when you've pulled them out of the water? Does your moral responsibility end when you've finished rowing them back to shore? Or do you maintain moral responsibility for them for the rest of their life? Imagine the same situation. You pulled them out of the water, you rowed them to the shore. They get in their truck, they drive home, and they go rob a bank. Was that your fault? Most reasonable people would say that you have no accountability for what they do after they're out of your power. So that is one of the issues that's still debated in utilitarian circles, and it's one of the issues that there's not been a very clear definition come down from on high. That leads us to the problems that utilitarians face and are still trying to answer to this day. First problem being, is there an objective scale with which we can measure the desirability of certain actions or outcomes? It would appear that there is not, but there are many utilitarians who try and say that there are some general principles for determining desirability that we can abide by. For example, it is desirable in all cases to not have to end a life, right? Any outcome which would result in the death of a person would generally be a bad outcome, right? It would be generally beneficial for people to not face starvation or great suffering, right? So we want to avoid outcomes that face those things. They say that because those things are part of our natural essence as humans, we can kind of mark those as being universal. However, there are still people that disagree with that perspective as well. Within utilitarianism, there's no basis for natural rights. There's no basis for saying that as humans, we have rights to other things. Jeremy Bentham said that natural rights was pure nonsense, nonsense on stilts. However, it would seem to be that it would be hard to have a society in which individuals did not have rights. Or if we look to societies where individuals have very few, if any, rights, it would seem to be that it's a rather deplorable condition and that people wouldn't want to live that way. So, for example, if you look to the citizens of North Korea, they have no rights and are under complete state control. If you ask anyone in the Western world, I doubt you'll find people that want to sacrifice their individual rights and freedoms to go live in a place where they're subjugated. Some utilitarians get around this by saying that the happiness of all individuals is weighted the same. That's how Peter Singer does it. So the happiness of a person you've never met living in a third world country is worth as much as your happiness. So therefore, you cannot perform actions which would hinder or limit their happiness. And then the final problem that utilitarianism has is the problem of sacrificing or scapegoating. We can imagine many situations and many societies in which some group of people might determine that it benefits the larger overall society to oppress or take rights away from a larger group. We can see when we look at, for example, Incan and Mayan cultures that practice things such as human sacrifice, that they truly believed that by sacrificing these individuals, they were bringing a greater good for their society. That is a problem that utilitarianism still cannot quite deal with, because we live in a world in which there are limited resources, limited time, limited money, limited power, limited natural resources, and it seems that there are going to be people who get the short end of the stick. So how morally complicit should we be when it comes to these situations which cause suffering to other people? Which leads us to our next topic, the ones who walk away from Omelas. This short story, written by Ursala K. Guin, has been circulated throughout the last 50 years or so and included in many science fiction books and collections. It's about 5 pages long, and I recommend that you read it if you get the chance. The high-level synopsis of this story is that you, the viewer, have been transported to a utopian city. You arrive right as a spring festival is beginning to start. There are parades through the streets, there are children singing, dancing, everyone full of joy, and you come to realize that this location, the city of Omelas, is a utopia. It is a place where everyone has reached a level of high contentment. It is not a place of suffering, it is not a place of pain, it is a place where each person has a good purpose and a good life. However, behind the scenes, in a government building, locked in a small dark closet, is a child who's being deprived, malnourished, tortured, kept in this dark closet alone, and the people of this city believe that their happiness and prosperity is only possible because this child is being kept in such depraved conditions, and they truly believe that were this child to be set free or to be brought into society or to be given any kind treatment at all, that their utopia would crumble. All the members of this society, when they reach a certain age, they're brought to see the child, and they leave this situation, most of them guilt-ridden and upset, but eventually come to accept it. They accept that their good depends on the suffering of this child. However, we see in this story that there are some people who, upon seeing this child, decide that they can no longer bear that on their conscience, and they decide to walk away from Omelas. They decide to leave and go off into the unknown. Now, this story, in some ways, is an analogy for Christian culture, which believes that our human sanctity and our human moral development depended on these sacrificing the brutal death of Jesus. It depended on this innocent man being tortured and killed, all to help advance our spiritual and moral development, right? But in other ways, this story speaks to a deeper issue with human psychology, an issue that we discussed at the beginning of the video with Vsauce's trolley experiment. There were two people that were willing to make a moral decision, and they were willing to do something, whether their action was right or wrong, choosing to switch the tracks, that's for them to decide. But the majority of the people, when faced with this decision, froze up. They did nothing. And that's what Ursala K. Guin is pointing us to in her story. The majority of society chooses to do nothing. They accept that this child's fate is the way that it's the way that it is, it's the way that it's meant to be, and they make no moral decision about it. The ones who do make a moral decision, they don't make the decision to save the child, to try and liberate the child. They leave it there, and then they wander off alone into the unknown. I put it to you, dear viewer, what would you do? Would you potentially sacrifice a utopian city for one child, or would you leave the child to rot? I myself have my own views. I think that, in the words of Emma Gold, the means become the ends. And if a society is willing to sacrifice one child for its happiness, then it would be willing to sacrifice 10 children, 100 children. It would be willing to sacrifice and wipe out whole swaths of society for their happiness. What happens if this child who's been locked in the room were to escape? Would they have to round up another child? What happens if, despite their best efforts to maintain this utopia, a natural disaster strikes? Would they have to start rounding people up and sacrificing them? We see this same thing has happened in societies that practice things such as human sacrifice. When things started getting bad, when there were droughts, when there were crises, the first thing they did was round people up to sacrifice to appease the gods. They felt that the good of the community was worth it to sacrifice the lives of these innocents. We see this in the case of just war theory. We see it in our modern times when it comes to the decisions of whether or not to airstrike certain individuals. It might be the case that you might have to kill 100 innocent people to take down one terrorist. You might have to bomb a city square to take out this bad guy. Many people are okay with that. Many people are fine with that. It might also be the case that there are no good answers in this situation. There is no morally justifiable thing to do. Sometimes in life, individuals are left with only bad choices, and there can be nothing good that comes from any choice. I like to think that there can always be a good choice found somewhere, but sometimes it does require the moral fortitude to make it. I really appreciate your time. Let me know what you think in the comments below and in the forums for the class, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.